Hello, and welcome to part two of this conversation. We're going to be talking about making a case for homosexuality. In this specific part, we're going to be talking about the historical context that have gotten us to where we're at now. I think by understanding all of the factors that have led to our current opinions, we can form better opinions. So, with that being said, I have three main sources that I'm pulling from for this part. I've included them in the description with a link so you can access them. For the most part on the slides, I haven't referenced which one I'm specifically quoting or citing because I'll pull from like two or three in most of the slides. And so if I were to cite each one, it would get pretty messy. So suffice it to say that I have these three sources and they're in the description if you'd like more information. A little bit about them. The first one is called Gay Life and Culture, A World History. So this is a compilation of pieces from professors, scholars, and historians. The second one is called Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality. This is a book that won the National Book Award, and it was written by a historian and professor at Yale University. And the last is called The Straight State, and this was written by a professor and researcher at Princeton. So, with that being said, let's jump in and let's talk about the historical context of homosexuality throughout history. For starters, let's make sure we're clear on what homosexuality is. For us, we hear that word and we tend to think of it as an identity or as an orientation, but throughout history, that hasn't been the case. For most of history, people have viewed either love or sex, but not necessarily a preference or an orientation behind it. That changed in 1869 when a man by the name of Carl Maria Kurt Benny wondered if maybe there was actually some kind of identity or preference behind the behaviors that he was observing. And so he came up with this term homosexuality. And then once he used it, it spread in popularity. And now we use it today. And it's very common and very familiar. But throughout history, that wasn't necessarily the case. So I just want you to keep that in mind, that we don't want our current lens to affect how we view the past. And that in the past, there wasn't necessarily this idea of identity or orientation. With that being said, the earliest documented example of what most likely was a same sex couple was in ancient Egypt. There were these two men. I don't know how to say their names, so we're going to call them K Dog and N Town. These two men were buried in a position that was usually reserved just for married couples and lovers. And so, because they were buried in this position, some historians believe that they were most likely a same sex couple. Other historians say that they were most likely friends, but because of the nature of their burial, most historians believe that this was likely a same sex romantic relationship. Like I said, this was in Egypt in 2400 BC, and inscribed in their tomb, it said that they were joined in life and joined in death. Next up, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. You've maybe heard this story before. Gilgamesh is basically an explorer. He and Enkidu go on quests together. It was written in 1700 BCE. In the story, Gilgamesh says that he loves Enkidu as a wife, and the two kiss, embrace, and cuddle together. Even though this is a epic, so it is a false story, it was made up. Often historians believe that the stories that are written during a time period illustrate the beliefs of the society that of which it's written in. So if there's documentation of seemingly same-sex couples, then it's likely that society permitted it. And so even though this relationship isn't like confirmed romantic, if the two kiss and embrace and cuddle together and they love each other as wives, then it seems like it's safe to say that there was probably some kind of same-sex undertones. Next up, we have Achilles and Patroclus, and this is very similar to the one before about these two men who go on these quests together. They're united in everything. They have a deep, intimate relationship. This one was written in the 8th century BCE, and in the story, after they both die, their bones are actually buried together, which was usually reserved for couples. In fact, in the 5th century BCE, so a few centuries later, Greek writers are writing about this story, and they refer to the two men as being homosexual, as we would understand it. In general, we're going to look at lots of different cultures and societies and see how homosexuality has been demonstrated in those cultures. Starting off with China. In the year 300 to 200 BCE, there were a few different stories that were written, and like I said, these stories tend to illustrate how cultures felt at the time. So the first story is the love of the shared peach. Basically, there was a duke and a court official who were going through an orchard, and the duke gives a half-eaten peach to the court official. Aw, and it's so cute and so sweetie. And so During this time period, people believed that that indicated like a romantic or an intimate relationship. And so in China at this time and throughout the rest of China, often people would say the love of the shared peach would be used to illustrate some kind of same sex relationship. The second one is Long Yang. Basically, a king and a lord are going fishing together. And while they're fishing, the king says that he's fishing and he's happy that he catches this fish, but then he catches a bigger one. And then he feels bad because he wants to keep this bigger fish, but the first fish is already dead. And so he says, I want to throw this first fish back, but because of this evil act, I will be expelled from your bed. And so it's alluding towards these two men sharing a bed together and being in a relationship. And because this one man caught a fish, it's dead, and then he caught a bigger fish that he wanted to keep instead, this other man is going to be disappointed in him and isn't going to want to sleep with him anymore. The last one is the love of the cut sleeve. It's this kind of sweetie story about an emperor and a man who are sleeping together, and the man is sleeping on the emperor's sleeve. And so the emperor wants to wake up and go about his day, but he doesn't want to wake up the lover. And so he cuts off his sleeve. And so then the lover can keep sleeping on it without being interrupted. And so also throughout China's history, the love of the cut sleeve was used to illustrate same sex relationships, some kind of interaction between two men that is more than just platonic. Also in China, we have this historian that was named Sima, and I don't know for sure how to say that last name, Shane. I don't know, that's my best guess. And this historian documented that of the Han emperors, 10 were openly bisexual. So even though relationships existed between men and women, it seems that those men would often have relationships with other men as well. Um, Sima said, it is not women alone who can use their looks to attract the eyes of the ruler. Courtiers and eunuchs can play at that game as well. Many were the men of ancient times who gained favor this way. Moving to the Americas, we have documented stories from many conquistadors who came to the Americas. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, he described the indigenous people of Mexico and said that most of them, moreover, were sodomites. Gasp, that's so scandalous. Next up, we have Cabeza de Vaca, and in 1530, he was describing a tribe near modern-day Texas, and he said, I saw one man married to another. And then we have Pedro Cieza de Leon, and he said the Papayan men pride themselves greatly on sodomy. And this was likely describing the Incan Empire before it was overtaken. And then last up, we have Hernan Cortez, and he commanded the natives to give up your sodomy and all your other evil practices. And so that was in the Mexican state that now forms Veracruz. So basically, we have these conquistadors who came to the Americas, and it seems like all throughout the Americas, there was various forms of same-sex relationships. And as the conquistadors came, they changed that up, they condemned it, and so it was no longer around. In Japan, we have what are called Chigo stories. In monasteries, it wasn't uncommon for monks to fall in love and to enter intimate and sexual relationships with each other. In fact, beginning in the 14th century, many novels were written that depicted monastic homosexuality. And then in 1540, Alessandro Valignano visited Japan and said that the people are guilty of the sin that does not bear mentioning. So it seems like it was around. It was a common practice. In the Shogun area, from the 12th to the 19th century, we have the samurai model of ninja and chigo. You're probably familiar with samurais before. They're like the really cool Japanese warriors. What would happen a lot of the time is you had what was called a ninja, and that was an older samurai. And then you had a chigo, who was a younger samurai. They were both males. And they would often enter intimate and sexual relationships to support each other while they were in battle or while they were fighting. So yeah, there was like these same-sex relationships between samurais. And it's documented that over half of the shoguns were like supreme military commanders. Over half of them between 1338 and 1837 had same-sex relationships. Also in Japan, we had the Tokugawa period, and during this period, subcultures blossomed and there was an explosion of homoerotic art and poetry. And there was a story that I found called The Tale of a Boor. And this was published in 1640. And I just pulled a little snippet from it. This is translated from Japanese. So there's a quote from it that says, "Lately, our friend so and so has been going crazy over young men." Do you relate to that? "When night falls, he washes up and, taking pains to look his best, he meets a lover and they lie together, speaking intimately." In Japan, we see other examples of this. In 1687, there was this book published called The Great Mirror of Male Love, and it was 40 short stories that were all about same sex love. And there was also a book called Wild Azaleas that was published a little bit later. And this was a poetry compilation presenting love between males. So it seems like it was pretty common, pretty prevalent in a few different forms. However, in 1859, Japan opened its ports to Western trade. And as they did so, monastic love, so love between monks, same sex relationships among the samurai, and homoerotic art were all denounced. And not even 20 years after opening their ports, homosexual relations between men was criminalized. 10 years later, it was repealed. But it seems like there was a lot of influence from the West when the trades were opened, and as a result, homosexual relations were condemned, and that kind of condemnation has continued to the present. Next up, we have the Sambia. This is kind of an interesting example. It's a tribe in New Guinea that was studied by Gilbert Hurt, who was an anthropologist in the late 1900s. And he found that this tribe had a rite of passage. Usually, a boy at around 10 years old would have oral sex with an older boy, and they believed that that would help the younger boy to become physically strong, socially mature, and reproductively competent. It was necessary in order for the boy to become a man. And so that would happen regularly. And then once the boy turned 15, he would become a donor for the younger boys. However, the expectation was that eventually all of the boys would have sexual relations with women and enter committed relationships with women. I know this is different from our perspective of homosexuality, where we would say homosexuality is a committed, monogamous relationship, and this is very different from that. But it's still kind of interesting to see homosexuality in a different culture. Next up, we have Africa. In 1928, Felix Brick observed the Nandi tribe and wrote that women satisfied each other alternately. When he said this, he implied it in a sexual sense. He also found that in the Kikuyu tribe, there was a word that said onik, and that was specifically used to describe a man who takes the active role in sex with other men. If no sex was being had between men, there would be no need to have this word, right? In the 1930s, E. Evans Pritchard, who was an anthropologist, observed the Zandi people in the northern Congo, and he wrote that men regularly slept with boys while at court, and some princes may have even preferred boys to women when both were available. In the 1930s, Gustave Holsert, I don't know how to say his last name. I'm so sorry, Gustave, and everyone else whose names I'm screwing up. I love you. So sorry. He observed the Nkundo tribe, and there was a specific phrase called Yaiga Bonsango, and that was to describe a woman who presses against another woman in a sexual sense. And Gustave also found that regularly girls would play both husband and wife. What he meant by that is you would have a woman, and then you'd find her married to another woman, and this other woman would be considered a husband and a wife, and one woman would just be considered the wife. Kind of interesting. Similarly, in the 1900s, Gunter found that in the Pangui tribe, boys would satisfy their sexual desires with other boys whom they approach indirectly via the customary inquiry of flowers. They offer their chosen friend plates of fruit and earth nuts, which the chosen boy accepts if he sexually consents. So basically, you would have one boy approach another, and he would give him a gift, usually of flowers, and if the chosen boy accepted, then they would sexually get together. However, this tribe seemed to condemn male-male relationships into adulthood. Once they became an adult, once they became men, they were expected to marry women and have kids. In 1927, in Mozambique, there was a word for anima, which was a husband, and another word, nikonstra, you get what I mean, town, and that was to describe a boy wife. And this boy wife would take on the domestic and sexual duties in the household. So basically, you would have a man and another man, and one of the men would be considered like a boy wife. In Africa as well, there were two anthropologists who documented that woman-woman marriage occurred in over 30 African populations, and that children would be conceived within these relationships by one of the wives having intercourse with a man approved by her female husband. So basically, you have two women who are together, one of the women has intercourse with a man as long as this other woman approves, and then they would have kids and raise them. In India, there was a text called the RG Veda. This was written in 1500 BC, and this is a collection of sacred hymns charting the beginning of the universe. It was considered a sacred text, and in that text, there is a deity named Agnioni who is the child of two mothers. We also find Ramayana epic, and that was written in the 3rd century BCE, and that tells of a monkey god spotting two women lying in each other's arms in the manner of lovers. And throughout India's history, there's been many sculptures, poems, and stories depicting same sex relationships. Usually, same sex relations would be depicted with the expectation that one would eventually marry and reproduce. Um, I found quite a bit of sculptures and art that I was going to include, but most of them were pretty graphic and didn't leave much to the imagination. And so I decided not to include them here. But let it be said that there's quite a bit that's out there. However, in 1860, there was the Indian Penal Code that was a law that was released, and it declared sodomy as a criminal offense, and unnatural acts were condemned. What's kind of interesting is you'll notice the mid 1800s coming up in several different places. In Hawaii, there's this word. I don't know exactly how to pronounce this. We're just going to say "I-cane," but if you split up the word, "I" means sex and "cane" means male or husband. And this term was used to describe an intimate relationship between partners of the same gender. Usually, what would happen is there would be a chief, and then there would be some kind of royal or official in the court, and they would enter an intimate, romantic, sexual relationship, even though they were of the same gender. It's documented that Chief Kalaniakoa of Kauai asked if a young, handsome European sailor would become his personal I-cane. And David Samuel, who visited Hawaii, I want to say in the 1800s, said that the I-cane is an office that is esteemed honorable among them, and they have frequently asked us on seeing a handsome young fellow if he was not an I-cane to some of us. And last but not least, we have the goddess Haiaka, who refers to her female lover Hapoa as her I-cane. So it seems like in Hawaii, there was some kind of bonding and love between people of the same sex. Next up, we have the Greek. Greek mythology is littered with different stories of same sex relationships. The first is that Zeus became enamored with Ganymede, who was a prince of Troy. Ganymede became a really popular term during the Middle Ages to describe what we would say is gay people. The two terms are used almost the same way. Like if someone was a Ganymede, that you would know, oh, like they're interested in relationships with men. Kind of interesting. In Greek mythology, all of the other gods, except for Ares, fell in love with other men at some point. We have this story of Apollo and Hyacinth. In this story, we have Apollo, who is the god of prophecy, and he neglected his duties to be with Hyacinth, who was a Spartan prince, and the two were really, really close. So Apollo started teaching him music, archery, and athletics, and one day they're spending time together. And while throwing a discus, Apollo threw a disc, and then there was another jealous god named Zephyrus, and he blew the disc off course, and it killed and it hit Hyacinth in the head, killing him instantly. And so Apollo is absolutely heartbroken and doesn't know how to go on, and so he transforms Hyacinth into a hyacinth flower, and that's where the flower comes from. Next up, we have Sparta. In Sparta, relationships were actually encouraged between mature soldiers and young recruits. So these two men would enter a relationship that was often intimate or sexual, and it was very similar to the samurai model. Like if you understand that, it's the same kind of idea. Next up, we have Thebes, which was during the 4th century BCE. They formed a secret band of 300 men, and it was completely made up of same-sex couples. Very interesting. Also in the Greek, we have this lady named Sappho. She was around during the 6th century BCE, and she was from the island of Lesbos. If the word Lesbos sounds familiar, that's where the word lesbian comes from. Sappho wrote pretty prolifically about other women and her love for them. And so the term lesbian comes from the island of Lesbos, which is where Sappho is from. During her poetry, she would praise the beauty of women and the love that they shared. And I just pulled one quote from her. She said, "Sweet mother, I cannot weave. Slender Aphrodite has overcome me with longing for a girl." As you'll see, lesbianism doesn't come up very often. Unfortunately, it isn't documented very much. And a big part of that is that the straight men who were in charge had a hard time believing that women would prefer other women as opposed to them. And so lesbianism was often discounted or it wasn't considered an actual thing. And so as a result, we don't have a ton of examples throughout history. But from what we can tell, there were documented women who loved other women and would even prefer to be in a relationship with women instead of being in a relationship with men. Continuing with Greek, in Athens, they actually didn't differentiate between same sex and opposite sex love. It was the same thing. They also had what was called pederasty, and this was probably the most common form of same sex relationships. What would happen in this situation is you would have a young boy referred to as an eromenos or a beloved, and he'd generally be between 12 to 18 years old. And then you'd have an erastes or a lover, and that was usually an adult or young adult man, and they would enter a relationship where the younger boy would be like a almost like a servant to the older man, and then the man would be like a guide to help the youth develop and get to where he needed to go. These relationships were almost always sexual, almost always intimate, and usually termed romantic. However, once the youth developed a beard, the relationship usually ended. Um, so during this time, it also wasn't uncommon for men to have a boyfriend despite being married to women. And as far as gay relationships go, there was a painter during this time named the Affector, if you want to look up some of his paintings. And he has many pieces showing love between men and boys of the same age. In fact, adult males could live together without being married to women. So even though pederasty was the most common form, where you had like a teenage boy and then an adult man who would enter a committed sexual relationship, it's also shown that there was love between men and boys of the same age. In the Greek as well, we have the Athens. And in Athens, homosexual behavior in the gym and wrestling school was standard, and sports were often associated with same sex relationships. During the Greek times, there was also a writer named Aristophanes who created the myth of the two halves. I don't know if you've heard of this before, but I think this just touches my little heart. He came up with this theory that humans used to be almost like a clump, where humans had 4 arms and 2 legs, or sorry, 4 arms and 4 legs, and then they rebelled against Zeus. And Zeus got really upset, so he cut them in half. And so now humans have 2 arms and 2 legs, but they're missing their other half. And so now everyone comes to Earth as like one person. However, there's their other half that they're trying to search, and that's where love comes from. So he believed that there were multiple kinds of people before they got split in half. So, for example, you would have two men who were together, but they got split in half. And so now those two men are trying to find each other. You'd have a man and a woman who were together, but they got split in half and now they're trying to find each other. Or you'd have a woman and a woman who were together, but they got split in half and they're trying to find each other. So basically, that was about trying to find your other half, regardless of the gender. That was a myth that he came up with. At this time, we also have Socrates, who was a philosopher, and he wrote that every person wants to extend their life. For heterosexual couples, they do it through childbirth, and for homosexual couples, they do it through artwork, philosophy, or political involvement. Next up, we have Rome, and we're really going to hold up a microscope to Rome because this is the place where Jesus was born, and then this is the place where Jesus was crucified. So we can see before Jesus was there and after Jesus was there, really get an idea for the culture. Edward Gibbon, a historian, said of the first 15 emperors, Emperor Claudius was the only one whose taste in love was entirely correct, meaning heterosexual. Historians document that the Roman Empire was ruled for almost 200 consecutive years by men whose homosexual interests, if not exclusive, were sufficiently noteworthy to be recorded for posterity. And last but not least, many homosexual relationships were permanent and exclusive, and marriages between males and females were legal and familiar. So even though same-sex marriages were legal and they were familiar, pederasty, like I mentioned, was still the most common form. But that's really interesting, where same-sex marriages were allowed. I found this story that I think is kind of funny that I wanted to include. There's this guy named Callidius I don't know how to say his last name, so we're going to call him Mr. Bonbon. And so when Mr. Bonbon, a man of no rank or family connections, was caught in the room with a married woman at night, ooh, so scandalous, his fate as an adulterer seemed sealed, but he got off scot-free by claiming that he was in the room on account of his passion for a slave boy. Thus, his confession of overwhelming desire freed him from any suspicion of crime. If homosexual relations themselves had been illegal, it hardly seems likely that Mr. Bonbon would have clung to his story. So basically, you have this guy who goes to this married woman at night. They're together. It seems really suspicious. They go to him and he says, "Look, I don't swing that way." And they're like, "Oh, okay, have a nice life then." I just think that's kind of funny. Um, During this time, not only does there appear to have been no general prejudice against gay people among early Christians, there does not seem to have been any reason for Christianity to adopt a hostile attitude toward homosexual behavior. Most prominent and respected Christians, some canonized, were involved in relationships which would almost certainly be considered homosexual. Did you catch that? Many prominent and respected Christians were involved in relationships which would almost be certainly be considered homosexual. We have a few different writings from people at the time. Mr. Felix here said that homosexual relations are the Roman religion. T Town said pederasty is held in preeminent esteem by the Romans. And Lactantius, I tried that one, maybe I shouldn't have, said homosexual acts are trivial and virtually admirable. And last but not least, we have Clement of Alexandria, who said that homosexual acts were legal, even though they were prohibited among the ancients. So they're okay now, even though in the past they weren't. Also in Rome, there were a number of wars and civil wars in the first century BCE that depleted the number of Roman men. And so as a result, the Emperor Augustus wanted family to be the cornerstone of Roman society. And so he put into place this law that every man under 60 years old and every woman under 50 was legally required to marry. Adultery was also punished more severely. However, homosexuality was still permitted as long as someone entered a sexual relationship with a person of the opposite sex. It didn't matter if they entered relationships with anyone of the opposite sex, which is super, super interesting. Around the year 305, there were a group of leaders who came together for the Spanish Council of Elvira, and they decided to deny communion, or like what we would say the sacrament, to men who defiled boys, but made no effort to regulate sexuality between consenting adult males or women of any age. So during this time, there were some efforts made to condemn what we would call pedophilia, but there wasn't anything done to condemn consenting sexual relationships between adult males or women. Also in Rome, we have this couple that I think is so cute. We have Hadrian and Antinous in the 2nd century CE. Hadrian was an emperor, and he was considered the most outstanding of the 5 good emperors. What a title. His rule was peaceful and productive, and he was considered the first emperor since Tiberius to retire in peace rather than be assassinated or die in battle. Hadrian married a woman but appeared to have no interest in his wife. This is a situation where it seems like because of the law, Hadrian married a woman, but it doesn't seem like there was really ever any connection there. In fact, some rumors say that he poisoned her, but historians disagree because there doesn't seem to be enough evidence. So that's Hadrian, and now we have, I don't know exactly how to say his name. Let's call him Ant-Man. We have Ant-Man, who was a young Greek, and the two of them fell in love. In fact, their passion was admired throughout the whole empire. But at one point, Ant-Man is crossing the Nile and he drowns and he dies. And it says that, and according to history, Emperor Hadrian wept like a woman. And then he had Ant-Man deified and established a festival in his name every 4 years. He also established games in several of the surrounding cities that were still celebrated 200 years later. And he founded a city on the Nile to honor Ant-Man. Not only that, he also had statues of Ant-Man built, in his words, throughout the entire world. So I think that's so, so cute and so, so sweetie. Historians have documented that during this time, gay couples and their love appear on a completely equal footing with their heterosexual counterparts. There was a book published in the 3rd century CE that documented homosexual and heterosexual romantic love appearing as absolutely indistinguishable except for the accident of gender. Some historians have said gay people were, in a strict sense, a minority, but neither they nor their contemporaries regarded their inclinations as harmful, bizarre, immoral, or threatening, and they were fully integrated into Roman life and culture at every level. Things started to change in around the year 340 CE, where the rulers at the time forbade passive homosexuality. So basically, in a same sex relationships, the man who was passive or who was being penetrated started to be forbidden. Under Roman law, power and dominance were really big themes. And so they started to say that if a man allowed himself to be dominated by another man, then that's not okay. That's a problem. A lot of this condemnation came with the rise of Christianity. There were texts that were being produced at the time that really influenced public thought. We're going to talk about those texts in a second. But homosexuality started to be condemned. A few years later, there was another ruler, Theodosius I, who ordained that all passive homosexuals in brothels should be burned alive. So if there's a prostitute who is playing the passive part, he would be burned alive. And then a little bit later, there was a new law in place that all men who assumed passive sexual roles should be burned alive. So this is like a combination of the last two laws that were put in place. And then finally, in 500 CE, there was an emperor named Justinian who ordered that all forms of homosexual behavior would warrant the death penalty. So during this time, Emperor Justinian, government control extended into all areas and not just homosexuality. By the end of the fourth century, many citizens could no longer choose their religion, their occupation, their place of residence, or even their favorite athletic team without imperial interference. So laws were being in place to really control public opinion, thought, and behavior, and homosexuality just happened to be one of those. During this time, when condemnations were starting to be brought forth, there was a poet named Meleager who wrote, "There is no desire for women in my soul, but the glow of males has set me on fire." During this time, it's documented that the basis of objections to homosexual acts shifted from personal preference to moral absolutes and prudery. Sorry, that's important. Where before people just kind of said you can do whatever you feel is best for you, but then it started to be any kind of homosexuality goes against morality and objective right and wrong. What's interesting is that a lot of times when we talk about the Roman Empire, I don't know about you, but I've heard before that Rome fell because they accepted same-sex relationships and that led to the downfall of the empire. But what we find is that that doesn't seem supported by the actual history. In fact, the period of greatest output of gay literature was not during the decay of the empire at all. In fact, homosexual writings from the third century on became increasingly rare, but from the first two centuries of the empire, when Rome was at the zenith of its power and prestige. In other words, as tolerance for homosexuality declined, political instability increased. And I'm not trying to say that there's a connection there, that Rome fell because they were starting to condemn homosexuality. I'm not saying that there's a causation there, but it does seem like there might be a correlation there where Rome fell and homosexuality was criminalized during that time, where when Rome was doing its best, homosexuality was common and accepted. So now the question of the day is, why did things change? How did we go from having gay marriages be allowed to a complete condemnation of them, to the point where people could be killed for engaging in any kind of same-sex acts? We're going to talk about that in the next part. So tune in, and I can't wait to hear what you think.